You think you know what corruption looks like. You've heard about the bad lawmen, the ones who took bribes, the ones who looked the other way, the ones who played favorites or drank too much or let the powerful walk while the poor paid. You've built a picture in your mind of what a crooked sheriff is. A weak man, a lazy man, a man who failed his office because he didn't care enough. That is not what Calhoun Price was. Price was not weak, he was not lazy, he cared about his work with a focus that for 12 years, the people of McDowell County, North Carolina mistook for dedication. He kept order in his county the way a man keeps a fire, constantly tended. Never allowed to grow uncontrollable, never permitted to die. He won every election he entered by margins that made the vote counts look embarrassing for his opponents. He was praised in 3 consecutive issues of the Marion newspaper as the finest peace officer the county had produced in a generation. He also never lost a suspect, not once. In 12 years, not a single person taken into Calhoun Price's custody ever stood trial in a McDowell County courtroom. Every one of them resolved before it got that far. Every case closed, every file sealed, every family told the same thing. Taken care of, move along, nothing left to see. That record seemed like competence. For 12 years, people called it competence. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because by the time this is finished, you are going to want to know that you are nowhere near the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina, and you are going to understand why the name Calhoun Price never made it into any history book that anyone put on a library shelf. McDowell County sits at the eastern edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina, where the high country begins to descend toward the Piedmont and the terrain changes from sheer ridge faces to a tumble of smaller hills, creek hollows, and river valley farmland. In the 1890s, when Calhoun Price first ran for sheriff, the county was not quite wilderness, but it was not far from it. Marion was the county seat, a town of a few thousand people with a courthouse, a newspaper, a handful of churches, and the kind of civic apparatus that a county seat was expected to maintain. But outside Marion, the county spread out into communities that existed on their own terms. River Bend farms, hollow settlements 3 and 4 miles off the main road, families who might go weeks without contact with anyone outside their nearest neighbors. The law in McDowell County was in practice one man, the county sheriff. He had 2 deputies at most, often only one, and those deputies were appointed at the sheriff's pleasure and served discretion. There was no oversight board, there was no internal review. If the sheriff of McDowell County decided that a matter was resolved, then it was resolved. The only check on his authority was the county court, and the county court only acted when a case reached it. If a case never reached the court had nothing to say. This is the arrangement that Calhoun Price inherited when he first took office in 1889. 1. He was 34 years old. He had a build that came from years of farm labor, wide through the chest, thick in the forearms, the kind of physical size that in that era communicated authority without a word being spoken. His hands were broad and scarred across the knuckles, the skin of them toughened to a near-leather texture from outdoor work in all seasons. His eyes were the pale gray of winter fog above the ridgeline, flat, assessing, never warm. He had served as a deputy for 4 years before running for the office himself. He knew exactly how the machinery worked. He was married. He attended church. He shook hands at the general store on Saturday mornings. He was present at funerals and at corn huskings and at the kind of community events that a good county official was expected to attend. He kept up every appearance of a man doing his job well. For his first 3 years in office, nothing seemed unusual. Crime in the county was low, or appeared to be. Disputes were settled. Troublemakers were brought in, spoken to, and released. The community understood this as Price managing things with a firm hand. Nobody thought to ask what being spoken to and released actually meant. Nobody thought to track where the troublemakers went afterward. Nobody asked why so many of them seemed to leave the county entirely and never come back. The first person to notice something wrong was not a lawman. It was a woman named Della Summer, 41 years old, who ran the boarding house on the main road through Marion. Della Summy had been running that boarding house for 15 years and had seen a considerable range of men come through. Travelers, timber workers, salesmen, drifters passing through on their way elsewhere. She had a memory for faces and a habit, noted by every person who knew her, of keeping a private ledger of the men who stayed in her rooms. Names, dates, where they said they were going. She had started keeping it after a theft in 1886 and had never stopped. On March 7, 1897, a man named Wallace Teague checked into Summy's boarding house. He was 29 years old, a former mill worker who had been passing through McDowell County on his way to Tennessee, where he had a brother in the timber business. He paid for 2 nights. He ate supper in Della Summy's dining room on the evening of March 7th and spoke briefly with 2 other boarders about road conditions west of Marion. He said he planned to leave early on March 9th. On March 8th, Wallace Teague was brought in by Sheriff Calhoun Price on a charge Della Summy could not later recall being clearly stated. He had apparently gotten into a disagreement of some kind at a livestock pen on the edge of town. She heard about it through her other boarders. She assumed Price had taken him to the county jail on the hill above town. She assumed Teague would be released by evening and would collect his things and be on his way. He never came back for his things. His room sat as he had left it for 3 full days before Della Summy cleared it. His personal effects, a leather traveling bag, a change of clothing, a letter folded in the breast pocket of his coat, remained in her custody. She recorded it in her ledger. She filed a report with the county courthouse stating that a boarder had abandoned his belongings. The report is still in the McDowell County court records held at the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh. No record exists of Wallace Teague being processed through the McDowell County Jail. No record exists of him being charged, tried, fined, or released. No record exists of him arriving in Tennessee. No record exists of him anywhere after March 8, 1897. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Drifters drifted. Men disappeared from their own lives for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else. It happened. You did not make a pattern out of one man's sudden absence. Della Summy thought differently. She put a mark next to Teague's entry in her ledger, and she kept watching. By the summer of 1899, Della Summy had 4 marks in her ledger, 4 men, all brought into Price's custody at some point during their stay in Marion, all of whom had failed to return to her boarding house to collect their belongings. 4 men whose trails ended at the threshold of the McDowell County Jail and did not resume on the other side. She was not a woman given to recklessness. She knew what she was considering. She knew the weight of it. She thought about it through the summer of 1899 and into the fall before she did the thing she did next, which was to take her ledger to a man named Arthur Blevins. Blevins was the editor of the Marion newspaper, the McDowell Times. He was 52 years old, a former Raleigh journalist who had come to Marion in 1884 and had run a small but carefully reported paper ever since. He was not a man who printed accusations he couldn't support. He was not a man who moved quickly. He read Della Summy's ledger entries for a long time. He asked her several careful questions. He thanked her and told her he would look into it. What Blevins found when he looked into it was that the official record of Price's 12-year tenure was almost perfectly clean. Cases opened. Cases closed, no trials, no escapes, no in-custody incidents of any kind on file. It was the record of a man who either never made a mistake or never documented one. Blevins began making his own list. He contacted families in the county who had reported a missing husband, a missing son, a missing brother in the years since 1891. He wrote letters to county records offices in Tennessee and Virginia and Georgia, asking whether specific individuals had been documented there after leaving McDowell County. He kept none of this in his office. He kept it at home, in a wooden box under a floorboard. He wrote in a private journal recovered by his daughter from that same box after his death in 1923 and donated to the Western Carolina University Special Collections in Cullowhee in 1971. I cannot yet print what I believe. What I believe is that the office of McDowell County Sheriff has been used for at least 8 years as a mechanism for the permanent removal of men this county was told had merely been dealt with. The removal is permanent. I have found no evidence that any of them arrived anywhere afterward. He was 54 years old when he wrote that. He had been a journalist for 30 years. He chose every word carefully. He wrote one more line below it. The question I cannot answer is where they went. But here is what nobody knew yet. What only became visible when Blevins pressed further into the land records of McDowell County in the spring of 1900. Price was not just making men disappear, he was taking what they left behind, not their personal effects, not their money, at least not primarily. He was taking their land. Of the 11 men Blevins had by then identified as having last been seen in Price's custody, 4 of them had owned small parcels of land in the county, creek-bottom lots, hillside timber rights, the kind of land that a man without much else might have counted as his primary asset. In every case, within 6 months of the man's disappearance, those parcels had been sold by family members who, when Blevins tracked them down, reported receiving visits from Price in which he had informed them quietly and with apparent sympathy that their husband or father or brother had decided to leave the county and had authorized the sale before going. The authorization documents existed. Blevins found 2 of them in the county deed records. Both bore signatures. Both were witnessed by Price's then deputy, a man named Lester Vane, who had served under Price since 1893. The signatures did not match the men's own handwriting in any other surviving document. Blevins noted this in his journal. He did not yet have enough to print. The fog had come down into the Marion Valley. The courthouse sat at the top of its hill. The light in Price's office window was on past midnight most evenings, the way it always was. the way the county had always understood as the mark of a diligent man. The investigation that ended Calhoun Price's tenure did not begin in McDowell County. It began in Asheville, 60 miles to the west, where a state attorney named Clement Dowd received a letter in October of 1902. The letter was unsigned. It laid out in 4 densely written pages a specific list of names and dates and land transactions, with references to county deed records and to the McDowell Times archive, and with 2 names, one living man who could corroborate the pattern and one dead man whose last known location was Price's custody. Dowd was 47 years old. A former circuit court judge, he had prosecuted 3 capital cases in Buncombe County and had a reputation within the legal community of western North Carolina for taking on matters that local jurisdictions could not handle without conflict of interest. He read the letter twice. Then he made a quiet request to the state attorney general's office for authorization to conduct an inquiry in McDowell County without involving the county sheriff's office. Authorization was granted on November 3, 1902. The inquiry lasted 4 months. Dowd worked with a single investigator, a former Pinkerton man named Roy Stiles, who entered McDowell County without identifying himself as connected to the attorney general's office. Stiles posed as a timber buyer. He spent 6 weeks talking to people in the county hollows, the families who had lost men to Price's custody, the neighbors who had watched land change hands, the men who had worked adjacent to Lester Vane and heard things they had not known how to report. On February 14, 1903, Stiles found the first physical evidence. He had been directed by a former farmhand to a section of limestone ridge in the eastern part of the county on land that had once been used for grazing and had reverted to scrub woodland over the previous decade. The farmhand said the land had a local reputation, that nobody grazed it anymore, that the cattle had refused it years before. He did not explain further. It was cold. The scrub trees were bare and black against a gray sky. Stiles walked the ridge for 2 hours before the smell reached him, not fresh old, the kind of smell that limestone country holds deep in its crevices, preserved by the cold and the dark. He found the first of the limestone fissures, narrow vertical gaps in the bedrock face, wide enough for a man to be forced through. He did not go further alone. He marked the location on his survey map and went back for Dowd. What they documented at that site over the following 3 days is recorded in Clement Dowd's official case file, which is held in the North Carolina Department of Justice Archives in Raleigh. The file is not sealed. It has never been sealed. It is simply very rarely requested. Dowd's report is precise and clinical in the way that legal documents are required to be precise and clinical. It catalogs what was recovered from 6 separate fissures along a 200-yard stretch of that limestone ridge. It notes that recovery was partial due to the depth of the fissures and the decomposition that had occurred over a period estimated at between 2 and 10 years. It notes that identifications were made in 3 cases through personal effects recovered alongside the remains. One of those effects was the letter Wallace Teague had been carrying to his brother in Tennessee. Still folded, still in the breast pocket of a coat. The pocket had protected it through years of cold and dark. The coat was Teague's. Della Summy identified it. She had described it from memory to Stiles 3 weeks before, without being asked about it, because she had a memory for details and she had been keeping Teague's belongings in a box in her storeroom for 6 years. Calhoun Price was arrested on March 22, 1903, at the McDowell County Sheriff's Office by state officers who arrived before dawn. Lester Vane was arrested the same morning at his home on the south edge of Marion. Price said nothing when the cuffs went on. He looked at the state officers the way he had always looked at everyone in that county, with pale gray fog-colored eyes that gave nothing back. He was held in Buncombe County pending trial to avoid any conflict with the McDowell jurisdiction he had controlled for 12 years. The trial was set for the fall term of 1903. He died in custody on August 9, 1903, of a cardiac event. He was 46 years old. The prison physician's report is on file. The cause of death was certified without dispute. He never testified. He never gave a name he had not been forced to give. He never explained the land transactions or the signatures or the fissures on the limestone ridge. He took every answer with him. Lester Vane pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of fraud related to the land deed forgeries. He served 4 years in the Buncombe County Jail and was released in 1907. He left North Carolina, and no further record of him has been found in any state archive. Arthur Blevins printed the story in the McDowell Times on April 2, 1903. It ran on the front page. He had waited 11 years to print it. He was 66 years old when he finally did. The limestone ridge in the eastern county was quietly deeded to a private family in 1906 and has passed through several owners since. It does not appear on any historical marker in McDowell County. Price's name was removed from the county sheriff's official record of office holders in 1904. The space where his name would have appeared was not filled with an explanation. It was simply left blank, a gap in the ledger that the county chose not to annotate. Today, the McDowell County Courthouse in Marion still stands. The sheriff's office occupies the same building it always has. Visitors to the county seat can walk the same main road that Wallace Teague walked in March of 1897 without knowing what that road led to for him. The boarding house where Della Summy kept her ledger was demolished in 1941. The ledger itself, she donated it to the McDowell County Public Library in 1929. 2 years before her death, is in the library's local history collection, in a box marked simply Miscellaneous Business Records, 1882-1927. It has not been checked out since 1974. The last name in the checkout log is illegible. Here is the question that this case will not let go of, and it is not the question about Price. We know what Price was, we know what he did. We know how he used the power the county placed in his hands for 12 years, and we know what he built with that power out in the scrub woodland on the limestone ridge. The question is about everyone else. Della Summy saw the pattern by 1899. Arthur Blevins saw it not long after her. The families who received visits from Price about land sales, they accepted those visits. The neighbors who watched land change hands, they noted it and said nothing. The deputy Lester Vane knew everything and signed every document he was asked to sign. A community of people saw the edges of what Calhoun Price was doing and found reasons one by one to look away. Were they afraid? Certainly some of them were. Was it easier to believe the official story than to confront the alternative? Almost certainly. Was it simply that no one person had enough pieces to see the whole picture until Della Summy collected them over years in a private ledger? Maybe. But here is the harder question underneath all of that. How much evil can operate in plain sight before the people around it become responsible for? At what point does looking away stop being fear and become something closer to participation? That line exists. It always exists. And in McDowell County, North Carolina, for 12 years, an entire community stood on one side of it and called what they were doing nothing. Some histories are buried because the people who made them made sure they would be. Calhoun Price is not in any history book. His name is not on any marker. The blank in the county ledger where his name should be is as close as the official record gets to acknowledging what he was. Was the community around him guilty of something? Or were they simply ordinary people trapped in a situation that gave them no good options? Drop your answer below. I want to read where you stand on that. If the stories that power erased, the ones that got filed away and stamped closed, and left in boxes that nobody opens, are why you're here, then subscribe and hit the bell. There are more of them. The archives run deep and dark, and we have only just started. Some names were forgotten because they deserved to be. Some names were erased because someone made very sure of it. The difference matters, and the difference is harder to find than you might think. Until next time, know who your sheriff is.